The King's Road north of King's Landing was a different road than the one that ran south. Steve had noticed this within the first day of riding, not a physical difference, though the terrain changed gradually from the cultivated fields around the capital to rougher, wilder country as the miles accumulated, but an atmospheric one. The road south carried the specific energy of people moving toward something: commerce, ambition, petition, the gravitational pull of power and money that capital cities exerted on everyone within their radius. The road north carried something older and quieter. People moving north were going home, or going to war, or going because there was nowhere else left to go. The distinction was in their faces and their pace and the way they looked. At the horizon ahead rather than back over their shoulders. Steve rode alone, which was how he preferred it when he needed to think. And he had a great deal to think about. The public declaration on the September of Baylor's steps had done what he'd intended. Placed the truth on record before witnesses too numerous to silence quietly. Cersei could manage consequences, but she couldn't unspeak words that several hundred people had heard. The story was already moving through King's Landing's underground networks, carried by the specific momentum that dangerous truths generated in places where dangerous truths were rarely spoken aloud. Varys had confirmed this in his last communication. The information was spreading faster than the Crown's ability to contain it, and the containment efforts themselves were generating additional suspicion among the lords who noticed them. What it would produce, Steve couldn't predict. He had learned in 3 months that Westerosi politics operated on timelines and through mechanisms that didn't respond to the interventions that worked in his world. You couldn't call a press conference. You couldn't appeal to an electorate. The truth mattered here only insofar as powerful people decided it was more useful to them than the lie. And powerful people made that calculation based on their own interests, not on any abstract commitment to accuracy. So he was going north, because north was where the real problem was. He had understood this intellectually since his first week with the Brotherhood, when the fragments of information about what lay beyond the wall began to accumulate into a picture that his experience with world-ending threats made uncomfortably recognizable. In his world, he had fought things that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be negotiated with, couldn't be appealed to on any basis that human beings understood as meaningful, things that simply ended life as a function of their existence. The descriptions of what moved in the dark beyond the wall had the specific quality of that kind of threat, not political, not territorial, not driven by comprehensible motivation, but existential in the way that a blizzard was existential. Not evil exactly, just inimical to everything that breathed and grew and lasted. The Stark token was warm in his closed fist on the second morning, which was impossible since it was a piece of cold northern steel, and which he noticed without being able to explain. He filed it alongside the other things in Westeros he couldn't fully explain. Beric's resurrection, Thuris's fire, Melisandre's shadow, the specific quality of certain moments when the world seemed to hold its breath and pay attention. This world had a force, or something like one. It was less clearly delineated than what he'd encountered in other situations, less responsive to individual will, more like a current in a river than a tool in a hand. But it was there. He felt it more clearly the further north he rode, as if proximity to whatever was happening beyond the wall made the current run faster. He was 3 days north of King's Landing when the first refugees reached him. They came south in a straggling column, 40 people, maybe 50, their faces carrying the specific blankness of people who had recently seen something that their minds were still deciding how to store. They were from a village north of the Neck, they told him when he stopped them. They had left because the ravens stopped coming, because the nights were getting wrong, because 3 men from the village had gone north to investigate a reported attack on a neighboring settlement and come back. Wrong, walking wrong, looking wrong, the eyes not quite tracking the way living eyes tracked. Steve gave them food from his pack. He had learned to carry considerably more than he personally needed, and listened to the old woman who seemed to be the group's informal center of gravity. She was maybe 60, maybe 80, the northern cold making ages difficult to read, and she described what she had seen with the flat, unembellished directness of someone who had decided that embellishment would make her sound mad and she needed to be believed. The 3 men who had come Back wrong had not bled when the villages. Blacksmith had cut one of them with an iron knife. They had not flinched. They had not spoken. They had simply walked into the village at midnight and begun the process of making more of themselves. Ice, the old woman said. Their eyes were the color of ice. Not blue. Not the blue eyes some people have. Ice. The color that ice is when there's nothing behind it. Steve gave the old woman his cloak, which she accepted without thanks, which he respected. He watched the column continue south and sat on his horse in the middle of the King's Road for a long moment, feeling the northern wind on his face and the weight of the stark token in his hand and the specific, focused gravity of a situation that had just confirmed what he'd been moving toward. He urged his horse north at a faster pace. The riverlands gave way to the neck gradually, the landscape flattening and dampening, the road's surface becoming unreliable where marshland encroached. Steve navigated it with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read terrain, and it was in the next border country that the Brotherhood found him, or rather that he found them, having heard their horses a quarter-mile ahead, through the marshes' specific acoustic properties and ridden to intercept. Beric Dondarrion looked different than he had in the Riverlands. Not worse, exactly, but more drawn, as if something was pulling at him from the direction he was facing. The Brotherhood were 12 riders now, reduced from their Riverlands numbers, their horses carrying the specific fatigue of a long, hard ride. We've been looking for you for a week, Beric said, without preamble, which was how he always operated when things were serious. What happened? Steve asked. Thuras saw something in the fire, Beric said. 3 nights ago. He won't describe all of it. You know how he gets when the visions are large. A pause. But the part he will describe is this. There is something moving south. Not raiding. Not ranging. Moving. With purpose and in numbers that the Night's Watch doesn't have the strength to address. He looked at Steve with the tired, honest eyes of a man who had died 6 times and was beginning to understand why. He saw your shield in the fire. The round thing that doesn't belong here. He saw it on the wall. Steve looked north, toward the invisible line of the wall somewhere beyond the horizon, and felt the stark token warm again in his closed fist. Then that's where I need to be, he said. We're coming with you, Beric said. Steve looked at the 12 riders, lean, road-worn, committed, the specific quality of people who had chosen what they were fighting for and weren't going to unchoose it because the scale of the enemy had grown considerably. He thought about arguing. He thought about the logistics of 12 additional people and the complicated operational picture they represented. Ride hard, he said instead. We're already behind. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop a character you'd love to see in an impossible world in the comments. They reached the outskirts of Robb Stark's camp on the 5th day north of the Neck, which was 2 days faster than the distance should have allowed, and which Steve attributed to the horses the Brotherhood rode, northern stock, built for endurance over elegance, capable of sustaining a pace that their southern counterparts would have broken under. The camp was larger than he'd expected and more disciplined, which told him something immediately about the young king who commanded it. Undisciplined armies announced themselves through noise and waste. Foraging parties too far out. Fires too large. Sentries positioned for comfort rather than coverage. Robb Stark's camp announced itself through the absence of those things, which was a considerably more sophisticated statement. The dire wolf banner snapped in the northern wind above the command tent. Steve was recognized at the outer perimeter by a guardsman who had been at Winterfell during Steve's visit and who passed him through with the specific wordless efficiency of someone who had been told to expect this and had instructions about what to do when it happened, which meant Robb had anticipated his arrival, which meant either excellent intelligence networks or someone had sent word ahead. Steve suspected both. Robb Stark at 17 was almost exactly what Steve had feared he would be. Gifted, instinctive, already carrying the weight of decisions that men twice his age would have struggled with, and operating in an environment where every one of his advisors had an agenda that was at least partially distinct from his own interests. He received Steve in the command tent with his senior lords arrayed around the map table. Greatjon Umber enormous and watchful. Roose Bolton quiet in a way that Steve filed carefully. The Blackfish Tully with the assessing eyes of a Professional soldier, and he did. Something that most commanders in Steve's experience didn't do when receiving someone with Steve's reputation. He asked a question rather than making a statement. My father trusted you, Robb said. His letter said you were the most honest man he'd met in King's Landing, which given King's Landing is either high praise or a very low bar. Which is it? Both, Steve said. Depends on the day. Something shifted in the tent, a recalibration. The lords around the table adjusting their assessments of the stranger. The Blackfish almost smiled. Sit down, Robb said. Tell me what you saw in the capital. All of it. Steve sat and told him. He gave Robb the full operational picture. Varys, Baelish, Cersei's specific capabilities and strategic tendencies. The public declaration on the September steps. The Watch's composition and the city's defensive geometry. The state of the Lannister political network as he understood it. He spoke for 40 minutes without being interrupted, which was itself a test. Commanders who interrupted were commanders, who were listening to confirm, rather than to learn. And Robb Stark listened with the focused, still attention of someone who was genuinely trying to update his understanding of a complex situation. When Steve finished, Robb was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not staying. It wasn't accusatory. It was the tone of someone reading a situation accurately and naming what he read. The threat in the South is political, Steve said. You can manage political threats. You're already managing them better than most men twice your age would. He paused. The threat in the North isn't political, and it's coming faster than anyone in this camp understands. The tent went quieter in a specific way, not the silence of people who hadn't considered something, but the silence of people who had considered it and put it aside, because the more immediate war was consuming all available attention. Roose Bolton's expression didn't change, which told Steve nothing. The Greyjohn's expression shifted into something that was either concern or dismissal, and Steve couldn't fully read which. The White Walkers, Robb said. Not a question, not dismissal either, just naming the thing. Whatever they are, Steve said. Yes. Old Nan used to tell stories, Robb said quietly. When I was young. Bran's favorite. She said they were real. Everyone thought she was telling ghost stories. He looked at the map on the table, at the vast white space above the wall that no one had drawn anything on because no one who went there came back with information worth recording. What do you need from me? This was the quality Steve had noticed in Ned and was relieved to find in the son. The absence of ego and practical decision-making. Robb wanted to know what was needed, not whether providing it would make him look strong. A letter of passage for the wall, Steve said. Night's Watch won't know me. A letter from the king in the north carries weight they'll respect. He paused. And horses. Mine is nearly done. Robb nodded to an aide without hesitation. Then he looked at Steve, with the gray Stark eyes that were so much his father's that the resemblance landed like a physical thing. My father sent word you might come north. He said. Robb stopped, something moving across his face. He said you were the kind of man who walks toward the fire, that he'd met very few of those in his life, and that he trusted them on instinct. Steve held his gaze. Your father was one of them. The thing that moved across Robb's face at that was complicated and private, and Steve didn't examine it closely because some things were meant to happen between a person and themselves. Come back from the wall, Robb said. When it's done, whatever it is you're going to do up there, come back. The North will need men like you for what comes after. A pause. My father's letter also said you belong to no one, which he meant as a compliment. I'm choosing to take it the same way. It was meant that way, Steve said. They clasped hands across the map table, above the drawn lines of a war that suddenly felt like the wrong scale of problem. And Steve left the command tent into the gray northern morning where Beric and the Brotherhood were waiting with fresh horses and provisions that Robb's quartermaster had produced, with the quiet efficiency of an army that ran on discipline rather than chaos. The Blackfish appeared at Steve's shoulder as he was checking his horse's tack. You know he's going to lose, the Blackfish said. Quietly, the specific, flat delivery of a professional soldier, delivering an assessment he had already made peace with. Steve looked at him. You don't know that. I've been doing this longer than you have, the Blackfish said. Not the fighting. The watching men make decisions that can't be taken back. Your man Bolton in there. I know, Steve said. The Blackfish looked at him sharply. You've seen his kind before. I've seen his kind everywhere, Steve said. In every war, every army. The man who's always quiet and always watching and always positioning. He tightened the girth on the horse's saddle. I told Rob to watch him. Whether he listens, he stopped. I can't make anyone listen. I can only tell the truth and move. Stark trait, the Blackfish said. Getting people killed with honesty. Better than living with the alternative, Steve said. The Blackfish studied him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has fought long enough to have considered all the arguments and arrived at an uncomfortable position on most of them. Then he nodded, the single nod of someone extending professional respect across a significant difference of opinion. Ride fast, he said. Whatever's coming down from the north. I want it slowed before it reaches my niece's children. That's the plan, Steve said and rode. Castle Black appeared on the horizon 2 days later as a dark interruption of the gray sky. Not impressive. Exactly, but permanent in the way that things built by people who understood necessity, rather than aesthetics, were permanent. The wall behind it was something else entirely. Steve had been aware of it for an hour before he could clearly see it, which was its own kind of statement. The wall announced itself through the specific quality of the cold that came off it, a cold that was different from the ambient northern temperature, the way a river was different from rain, purposeful, directed, ancient. He stopped his horse a quarter-mile out and looked at it. He had seen large things in his life. He had stood beneath structures in his own world that dwarfed human scale, and he had encountered things in other situations that made those structures seem modest. But the wall had a quality that wasn't about scale. Exactly, or wasn't only about scale. It had been built by people who understood that what they were building against was real and large and patient, and that understanding was embedded in the wall's construction. The way fear was embedded in a fortress's walls and reverence was embedded in a cathedral's. It was a monument to an acknowledgement. Something is coming, the wall said. We knew. We built this because we knew. 7 hells, Angui said softly, from somewhere behind Steve's left shoulder. The archer had ridden with them from Rob's camp. Rob had sent him as a guide through the final northern approaches, and he'd stayed because the Brotherhood was his family and because, Steve suspected, the scale of the situation had acquired a gravitational pull that made turning back feel like the wrong direction, even for someone with no formal obligation to go forward. Every time, Barrick agreed, which suggested this was not his first view of the wall and that it hit with equivalent force regardless. They rode to the castle's gate. The Night's Watch received them with the specific wariness of an institution that had been understaffed and undersupported for so long that suspicion had become its default social register. The commander of the gate, a weathered man with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and the patient, evaluative eyes of someone who had learned to read dangerous situations quickly, looked at Steve's blue tactical suit and round shield with an expression that moved through surprise and settled on careful assessment. You'll want to speak to the Lord Commander, he said, after reading Robb Stark's letter twice. The Lord Commander was Jeor Mormont, called the Old Bear, and he was exactly the kind of man Steve had learned to identify in the first 30 seconds of meeting someone, a person who had taken a difficult assignment when easier options were available and had done it for reasons that had nothing to do with reward. He was broad, gray-bearded, with the specific physical quality of someone who had been strong their whole life and was still strong but knew the direction of travel. He had a raven on his shoulder that watched Steve with unnerving intelligence. He read Rob's letter once, set it on his desk, and looked at Steve with the directness of a man who had stopped performing courtesy because his circumstances had worn the performance away. What are you? Mormont asked. A soldier, Steve said, from a long way away. That shield, Mormont said. I've seen a lot of shields. I've never seen anything like that. No, Steve agreed. You wouldn't have. Mormont looked at him for a long moment with the raven shifting on his shoulder, its black eyes moving between them with something that felt uncomfortably like comprehension. Then the Lord Commander made the decision that Steve was coming to recognize as the signature move of genuinely capable leaders. He stopped trying to categorize the situation and focused on what was useful about it. Can you fight? Mormont asked. Yes, Steve said. Will you? That's why I'm here. Mormont nodded. We're 200 men short of what this wall requires to function, he said, with the flat honesty of someone who had sent ravens to King's Landing and the Red Keep and Winterfell and received responses that ranged from inadequate to insulting. We have reports from rangers that something is moving south beyond the wall in numbers we haven't seen since. He paused. Since before the records we have are reliable, which means before the last long night. He let that sit. Most of my senior officers think the Rangers are exaggerating. The cold does things to men's minds. They're not exaggerating, Steve said. Mormont looked at him sharply. You've seen something. Refugees. 3 days south. A village evacuated because 3 men came back from beyond the wall walking. Wrong. He paused. I've encountered threats that couldn't be reasoned with before. The description fits. The raven made a sound, not quite a word, but with the quality of a comment, and Mormont reached up absently to settle it. My son, he said, quietly and entirely without context. And Steve filed it without asking. Because some things people said weren't invitations to inquire, but simply things that needed to be said aloud occasionally. Jon Snow found Steve at the evening meal. Steve had been aware of him since arrival. A young man of maybe 16 with the stark look softened by something else. Dark-haired and serious, moving through Castle Black, with the specific self-contained quality of someone who had learned to need less from his environment than most people because his environment had consistently provided less than most people required. He sat across from Steve at the long table in the mess hall with his direwolf ghost, settling enormous and white at his feet, and looked at Steve with eyes that were doing the same work Steve's eyes did when he met someone new, assessing, organizing, updating. You were at Winterfell, Jon said. For a week, Steve said. Your father invited me. Something shifted in Jon's face at that, the specific movement of someone who loves a person and is currently separated from them by circumstances that include real danger. Is he? He's north, Steve said. On a ship with your sisters. Safer than he was. He paused. The situation in King's Landing is complicated. He's not out of it, but he's not in the worst part of it anymore. Jon absorbed this with the controlled stoicism of someone who had been practicing stoicism for years and was very good at it, but still felt everything underneath the practice. Ghost shifted at his feet, the enormous white direwolf pressing closer to Jon's leg in the specific animal way of a creature that sensed its person needed contact. Why are you here? Jon asked, not suspiciously, with the directness of someone who had learned that the direct question was usually the most efficient path to useful information. Same reason the wall is here, Steve said. Because whatever's on the other side of it is real and someone needs to deal with it. Jon looked at him with those dark eyes that were processing something more than the words. Most people who come to the wall come because they have no choice. I have a choice, Steve said. That's exactly why I'm here. They sat in the mess halls, low light with the fire at the room's end, pushing back the cold that the wall conducted through the castle's stones. And Ghost watched. Steve with yellow eyes that held the same unnerving quality as Mormont's raven. The sense of being assessed by something that understood more than it should. I want to go beyond the wall, Steve said. I need to see what's out there. The Lord Commander is organizing arranging. I want to be part of it. Jon was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going on the ranging. I know, Steve said. I could see it on you when I walked in. Jon looked at him with something that was partly surprise and partly recognition. The expression of someone meeting a person who reads people accurately and finding it both useful and slightly unsettling. How? You have the look of someone who's already decided, Steve said. The decision's made. You're just waiting for the moment to move. He paused. I know that look because I've worn it most of my life. Ghost made a low sound, not threatening, something closer to acknowledgement. And Jon's hand dropped to the direwolf's enormous head in the unconscious gesture of someone who had been doing that since the animal was small enough to hold. We ride at first light, Jon said. If the Lord Commander agrees. He'll agree, Steve said. He was right. Mormont gave his authorization before the evening was done, with the specific expression of a man who had received an asset he hadn't requested and was experienced enough to deploy it. Before it disappeared, the ranging would go north. Steve and Jon would ride with it. The Brotherhood would maintain position at Castle Black. Beric had argued for coming beyond the wall, and Steve had explained, carefully, that what he needed beyond the wall was mobility and speed, and 12 riders were neither. Beric had accepted this with the grace of a man who had learned that the right deployment wasn't always the most dramatic one. That night, Steve stood at the base of the wall and put his hand against it. The stone was impossibly cold, a cold that was different from ambient temperature, the specific cold of something that had been cold for thousands of years and had organized its existence around that fact, through the stone, or possibly through the stark token warm in his other hand. He felt the current he'd been sensing since the neck, running faster and stranger now, the world's version of whatever. The force was paying attention to something very large and very close and coming closer. He stood there for a long time in the dark. Above him the wall rose into the night sky, and above the wall the stars were different than they were in the south, clearer, harder, more numerous, the cold having stripped the atmosphere of whatever softened them elsewhere. In the distance, so far north that it was almost beyond hearing, something that might have been wind made a sound that was almost not wind. Steve listened to it for a long time. Then he went inside, checked his gear, and slept the light, functional sleep of someone who had learned to rest efficiently, because rest was a resource like any other, and tomorrow was going to require all of them. The ranging party was 17 men when it crossed through the gate in the wall at dawn, 9 seasoned rangers. 5 stewards pressed into service by the shortage of available fighters. Jon Snow and Steve Rogers. The gate itself was a tunnel bored through 200 feet of ice and ancient stone, lit by torches that did almost nothing against the cold pressing in from both sides. And emerging from it was the specific experience of crossing a threshold that the world itself had decided was significant. The air on the north side was different, not just colder, though it was considerably colder, the kind of cold that made the lungs work harder and turned every breath visible, but different in quality, as if the wall filtered something in both directions, and the something it kept on the north side had been accumulating for a very long time. Sir Otten Withers commanded the ranging, a veteran ranger of 50-odd years with the economical movement of someone who had survived beyond the wall multiple times by being careful rather than brave, and who received Steve's presence with the professional equanimity of a man who had stopped being surprised by what the Lord Commander decided to attach to his rangings. He briefed the party at the wall's north face with the specific directness of someone for whom brevity was survival practice. They were riding to the fist of the first men, a defensible position 3 days north where a previous ranging had reported evidence of wildling displacement, large-scale displacement, the kind that suggested pressure from further north rather than the seasonal movement that rangers understood and could predict. Jon rode beside Steve for the first hour through the haunted forest, Ghost ranging ahead through the trees, with the silent efficiency of an animal that understood the assignment. The forest beyond the wall was different from the Wolfswood south of Winterfell, older, denser, the trees enormous in the way of things that had grown without human management for centuries, their canopy so thick that the gray sky was visible only in fragments. The specific quality of the silence was what registered most forcefully. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a silence that had weight, that pressed back against the ranging party's noise, hoofbeats and harness jingle, and the small, unavoidable sounds of 17 people moving through wilderness, the way water pressed against a hand submerged in it. "It's always like this?" Steve asked. "Worse today," Jon said. "Usually there are birds." Steve listened. Jon was right. The forest was producing none of the ambient sound that forests produced. No wind in the upper branches. No small animal movement in the undergrowth. None of the bird calls that formed the continuous background of any living woodland. The silence had the quality of an evacuation rather than a mourning. He filed it and rode on. They made camp on the first night in a defensible hollow, the rangers setting watch. Rotations with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that beyond the wall, the cost of carelessness was not a reprimand, but a death. Steve took a watch in the 3rd hour of night, the deepest part, when the cold was most severe, and human alertness was at its natural low, and stood at the camp's northern perimeter. looking into the darkness between the trees with the enhanced senses that the serum had given him and that were out here earning their value in a way they hadn't in King's Landing's political intrigues. He could hear further than any of the rangers. He could process what he heard more quickly. What he heard in the third hour of the first night beyond the wall was nothing. Which was the problem? A nothing that was too consistent, too uniform, too total to be the natural silence of a sleeping forest. Natural silence had texture. This didn't. Something was keeping the forest quiet. Something that the forest, in whatever way forests knew things, had decided it was better to be silent around. He didn't wake the camp. He stood at the perimeter and listened and watched until the watch rotation brought Withers out to relieve him. And he told Withers what he'd noticed with the specific factual brevity of an operational report. Withers listened with his face doing nothing and then said, very quietly, "That's the fourth time in 6 rangings I've heard that description." He paused. "The other 3 times. We found what was making it quiet before it found us." "Barely. What were they?" Steve asked. "Whites," Withers said. "Dead men walking, moving like they had a destination." He looked north into the dark trees. "This time the quiet is bigger. More of it. Further in every direction." He pulled his cloak tighter against the cold. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we reach the Fist." The Fist of the First Men was an ancient ring fort on a high hill north of the haunted forest's edge. Circular, defensible, built by people whose names survived only in what they'd built. Which was enough to tell you that they had understood the principle of high ground and clear sight lines, and the specific tactical value of a position that required an enemy to come uphill to reach you. The ranging party arrived at midday on the second day and found it empty of living people, which Withers had expected. What he hadn't expected, what none of them had expected, from the quality of the silence that fell over the party when they crested the hill and saw it, was what had been left. The ground around the Fist's outer ring was covered in a pattern. Not random, not the chaotic residue of violence, but a pattern, curved lines of what had been body parts, arranged with the specific deliberateness of something that was making a statement rather than simply killing. Steve had seen things in his long, strange life that had been designed to communicate through horror, and this communicated. It said, "We know you come here. We are not afraid of your positions. We are not afraid of anything you have built." John dismounted and stood at the pattern's edge, Ghost pressing against his leg, the direwolf's white fur standing up along its spine, with the specific involuntary alarm of an animal whose threat sensing was not operating within its normal parameters. "How long ago?" Steve asked Withers. "Days," Withers said. He was pale under his weathering. "This was a full patrol. 12 men. They were here 3 weeks ago when we last." He stopped. 12 men. There are parts of 12 men. Here. Arranged. He looked at Steve with the eyes of someone updating his understanding of the scale of the problem in real time and finding the update extremely unwelcome. "They knew we'd find this. They wanted us to find it," Steve said. He walked the pattern's outer edge with the careful, methodical attention of someone reading a tactical communication, which was what it was. He had encountered this before in different forms, the deliberate message left to produce specific psychological effects in the people who received it, demoralization, demonstration of capability, the communication of an intelligence that understood human psychology well enough to weaponize its own cruelty. That was the part that landed heaviest. The White Walkers, whatever they were, whatever logic governed them, were not operating on pure instinct. This arrangement had required decision-making, aesthetic judgment, even in the most disturbing sense of the word. Something had looked at these bodies and chosen how to arrange them for maximum effect on the people who would find them. "John," Steve said. John came to stand beside him at the pattern's edge. The young man was doing what Steve had watched him do since Castle Black, feeling everything and showing nothing. The specific discipline of someone who has learned that falling apart is a luxury unavailable in the present moment. "What do you see?" Steve asked, because he had learned that asking people what they saw rather than telling them what he saw produced better operational intelligence and better people simultaneously. John looked at the pattern for a long moment. "It's a message," he said. "What does it say?" John was quiet. "It says they're not hiding anymore." He looked at Steve. Everything I've heard from the rangers, the wildlings fleeing south, the reports of things in the dark, all of it. It's all been out there, beyond where we patrol. Far enough north that you could explain it away. Pretend it wasn't. He paused, accelerating. He looked back at the pattern. This is inside our ranging distance. They came here specifically. They knew this was where we come. Yes, Steve said. That means they've been watching us. Yes. John absorbed this. Ghost moved around the pattern's edge with the careful, wide-berth attention of an animal that wanted information about a threat, but had the wisdom not to get too close to the place where the threat had been. The direwolf made no sound. What do we do? John asked. It was the right question, asked in the right way, not panic, not denial, not the aggressive deflection that some people used when a situation exceeded their previous experience. Just the forward-facing practical question of someone who had updated their understanding and was ready to act on the update. We go back, Steve said. Tonight. Fast. We tell the Lord Commander what this means and what it requires. He paused. And then we figure out what stops them. Because something does. Everything that exists has something that stops it. John looked at him with the dark, stark eyes. You sound very certain of that. I've had to be, Steve said. Every time. And every time something stopped whatever I was facing. A pause. The stopping is never easy. But it's always possible. Ghost returned to John's side and pressed against him, enormous and warm. And John's hand dropped to the direwolf's head with the unconscious certainty of someone who had been doing that gesture, since they both fit in a single pair of arms. Above them, the gray sky had darkened while they stood at the fist, the cloud cover thickening in the northwest, with the specific quality of weather that had intention behind it. The temperature, already brutal, dropped another degree. Then another. We should move, Withers said. From behind them, his voice carrying the flat urgency of an experienced ranger reading conditions that his experience was telling him were moving in a direction he recognized. They moved. They were 2 hours south of the fist, back into the haunted forest cover, when Ghost stopped moving entirely and stood rigid in the path ahead. Every line of the direwolf's enormous body, communicating a single message with perfect clarity. Something was behind them. Steve had the shield off his back and on his arm before the ranging party had fully registered Ghost's alarm, which gave him approximately 3 seconds of preparation over the rest of the group, and 3 seconds in Steve's experience was the difference between a manageable situation and a catastrophic one. He moved to the party's rear without being asked, because the rear was where the threat was, and because moving to where the threat was had been his instinct since before the serum, and the serum had simply made the instinct more executable. The forest behind them was doing the thing the forest had been doing since they'd crossed the wall. The total, weighted silence, but amplified now. The silence pressing in from multiple directions simultaneously rather than simply from the north. Steve processed this geometrically. Encirclement. Not complete. There was still forest to the east that hadn't gone fully quiet, but significant. Whatever was behind them had distributed itself across their likely retreat paths with the tactical intelligence that the arrangement at the fist had already demonstrated. Withers, Steve said quietly. How far to defensible ground? Half-mile east, Withers said, with the controlled tension of a man overriding his fear with operational habit. Old streambed. Stone banks. Narrows the approach. Take the party there, Steve said. John stays with me for 30 seconds then follows. Go now quietly. Withers moved without arguing, which Steve respected enormously. The party shifted east through the trees, with the disciplined quiet of rangers, who had trained for exactly this kind of movement. John came to Steve's shoulder, Ghost pressing against John's other side, the direwolf's yellow eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees to the north and slightly west. How many? John asked. I don't know yet, Steve said. Ghost does. John looked at the direwolf. Ghost was doing something Steve hadn't seen the animal do before, not the aggressive bristling of an animal preparing to fight, but a slower, deeper response. Something more fundamental than threat preparation. The direwolf was afraid. Not the fear of a dangerous enemy, but the fear of something that registered differently from every other category of dangerous thing Ghost had encountered in its life. Its massive body was trembling with a fine, continuous vibration that had nothing to do with cold. He's never, John started. I know, Steve said. Move. Now. They moved east, covering the half-mile to Withers streambed. Position in 4 minutes through terrain that was difficult in the dark but manageable for Steve's enhanced proprioception and for John, who moved through the northern wilderness with the specific competency of someone raised by people who understood that the North required real skill rather than perform bravery. Ghost moved between them, silent despite its size. The streambed was what Withers had promised, a cut in the landscape where an ancient watercourse had worn down through the surface, rock to exposed stone banks on either side, the channel itself frozen solid. The approach from the north narrowed to a front of maybe 30 feet by the banks. Geometry. The ranging party had arranged itself along the southern bank with torches lit, 4 of them, pushing back the dark in a radius that gave them maybe 20 feet of visibility. Beyond the northern bank's edge, Steve took position at the center of the northern bank's line, shield forward, and waited. They came out of the dark 3 minutes later. Not quickly. That was the first thing Steve registered, the specific deliberateness of the approach. Unhurried, as if speed was a concern that didn't apply to the things crossing the frozen streambed toward them. There were 11 of them in the first wave, which Steve counted automatically. And they were what the old woman on the King's Road had described and what the pattern at the fist had implied. Dead men walking, their movement wrong in the specific way that things moved, when the mechanism driving them was not the mechanism they'd been built for. They wore the remnants of clothing, furs, leather, the scraps of equipment, but the cold had done something to the flesh underneath. And their eyes, in the torchlight, were the color that ice was when there was nothing behind it. Blue-white, utterly empty. Looking at them directly produced the specific unease of looking at something that appeared to have a face but didn't have whatever a face was supposed to contain. The Rangers loosed arrows. Some landed. None of the whites that were hit stopped moving, which Steve had anticipated from the old woman's account of the iron knife that had produced no blood and no response. He was already moving along the bank to his left, where 2 whites had found a shallower crossing point. The shield extended, and he hit the first one with a controlled strike that would have put a living man down for a week. The white went down. Then it got up. Steve registered this with the focused calm of someone updating their operational parameters in real time. Physical impact? Insufficient. The white was back on its feet in 4 seconds. The damage he'd inflicted visible but non-functional as a deterrent. He hit it again, harder, with the shield's edge rather than its face. And this time the arm came off at the shoulder. The white kept moving, now with one arm, its trajectory unaffected. Dismemberment slows but doesn't stop, he filed. What stops them? He heard John shout from his right, not in pain, in alarm, and pivoted to see John fighting 2 whites simultaneously with a sword. That was doing the same insufficient damage Steve's shield was doing. The whites taking cuts that would have been debilitating to living men and continuing their advance with the patient, uninterruptible purpose of things that had been reprogrammed past the point where pain or damage had operational meaning. Then John's sword connected with the neck of the nearest white, and something happened. The white didn't slow down. It didn't register the impact as damage. It shattered. Not broke, shattered. The specific crystalline fragmentation of something that had been cold so long and so completely that its structure was ice all the way through, and John's sword had struck it at an angle that transmitted enough force to exceed whatever structural tolerance the cold had created. The white came apart in a spray of frozen fragments and simply ceased. John stared at the space where it had been with the expression of someone whose brain was racing to catch up with what his eyes had just recorded. Cold, Steve said, from across the streambed, still moving. They're cold all the way through. What breaks ice? Fire, Withers said from the bank. And Steve heard the specific sound of a torch being taken from its bracket. What followed was instructive rather than triumphant. Instructive in the way that discovering a weakness was always instructive, which was that the weakness was real and exploitable, but not unlimited and not a solution by itself. Fire worked. The whites burned with a speed that suggested their preserved state was highly flammable, and a burning white stopped functioning within seconds rather than continuing, with injuries that would have stopped a living man. But there were 11 whites in the first wave and 4 torches, and the ranging party had not come equipped for fire-based combat, and the torches were not indefinitely renewable. They stopped the first wave. Steve did the accounting while the last of the 11 stopped moving. 3 rangers with injuries ranging from serious to very serious, 1 steward dead, the torches burning lower, and the forest north of the stream bed producing the total silence again, which meant there were more out there. And the silence was the forest's response to their presence. First wave, Steve said to Withers. Yes, Withers said. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye and pressing a cloth to it with the automatic practicality of someone who had been injured before and knew the sequence of actions. They do that. Test first. How many in subsequent waves? Withers looked at him. The last time I saw whites in numbers, 2 years ago. Further east, the first wave was 8. The second wave was 40. He paused. We didn't find out what the third wave was. Steve looked at his ranging party. 15 people now, down from 17. The injured reducing effective fighting capacity further, the torches guttering. The forest producing its weighted silence in every direction except east, which was still holding a thread of normal sound that might mean a gap or might mean nothing. We move, Steve said. East first, then south. Fast. The injured, one of the stewards started. Move with us, Steve said. We carry the ones who can't walk. We don't leave anyone. He looked at the steward with the specific directness of someone for whom this was not a tactical position but a principle as foundational as anything he owned. Nobody gets left. That's not a discussion. The steward looked at him for 1 second, then nodded and moved to help the nearest injured ranger to his feet. John appeared at Steve's shoulder while the party organized itself for movement. Ghost pressed against his leg. The direwolf's trembling reduced now, not gone, but reduced, as if the action had discharged some of the fear into something more manageable. The fire, John said, and the shattering. There has to be something that does it reliably, not just torches. Dragonglass, said an older ranger named Dolores Ed, who had been fighting with a methodical joylessness that Steve found oddly reassuring throughout the engagement. Old stories. Obsidian. The knights. Watch as a cache at the fist had a cache. He paused. Which is now behind us. Dragonglass, Steve repeated, filing it. And what else? Valyrian steel, Withers said, from Steve's other side. He was looking at John's sword with an expression that was recalculating something. The sword, when it shattered the white. John looked at his sword. It's Valyrian steel, he said quietly. It was my father's, Lord Commander. Mormont gave it to me before the ranging. Something moved across his face at that, the weight of what the sword represented. Its provenance, the man who had given it. I didn't know it would. Now you do, Steve said. Keep it moving. We can figure out the implications at Castle Black. They moved east through the forest in a tight formation. Steve at the rear, shield facing north. Ghost quartering ahead to find the cleanest path through the trees. Above the canopy, the sky had gone from dark gray to the specific purple-black of a sky with weather in it, and the temperature continued its patient descent. Behind them, the silence followed. They reached Castle Black 14 hours later, which was 6 hours faster than the ranging's outward journey had taken and represented the kind of pace that left men genuinely depleted, not the performative exhaustion of people who had worked hard, but the real, structural fatigue of bodies that had been asked to sustain maximum output for an extended period, and had complied and were now presenting the bill. 3 of the injured rangers needed the maester's immediate attention. One of them, a veteran named Ricker who had taken a white's hand across his shoulder with enough force to dislocate the joint, had developed a fever on the march south that Steve recognized as the specific fever of a wound that had been contaminated by something the body didn't have a protocol for. Steve stood outside the maester's quarters for an hour while Ricker was treated, not from sentiment exactly, but from the specific obligation he felt toward people who had been injured in operations he'd been part of. And when the maester came out and said Ricker would keep the arm and likely survive, Steve nodded once and went to find Mormont. The Lord Commander received the ranging party's report in his solar with the raven on his shoulder and the specific expression of a man who had been prepared for bad news and received news that was worse than his preparation had accounted for. He listened to Wither's formal account first, then to Steve's supplemental assessment, then to John's description of the Valyrian steel's effect on the white, then to Dolorous Ed's account of the dragonglass cache at the fist, and then he sat in silence for a long moment with his broad hands flat on the desk and his gray eyes looking at the wall above. Steve's head with the inward quality of a man running calculations, whose outcomes he didn't like. Dragonglass, Mormont said finally. In quantity, Steve said. Whatever you can get. And Valyrian steel, though I understand that's considerably less available. Considerably is generous, Mormont said. There are perhaps 24 Valyrian steel weapons in the entire 7 kingdoms that we know of. Lord's heirlooms. Family relics. He looked at John. And one here now? Which is, he paused, not an accident. I'm beginning to think. John said nothing, which was its own kind of response. Dragonglass is more achievable, Steve said. Where does it come from? Dragonstone, Mormont said. The old Targaryen seat. The island fortress. There's supposedly an entire mountain of it there. The volcanic rock is dragonglass. Throughout. He paused. Currently occupied by Stannis Baratheon, who is using it as his base of operations for his claim to the Iron Throne. Steve held this information and turned it over. Stannis Baratheon. He had heard the name in King's Landing, a third claimant to the throne, after Joffrey and Robb. Rigid and methodical where the others were reactive and emotional, with a reputation for absolute commitment to duty that people described as either his greatest strength or his defining limitation, depending on their relationship with inflexibility. I'll need to speak with him, Steve said. Mormont looked at him with something that was almost amusement. Stannis doesn't receive visitors who simply decide to speak with him. I'll figure it out, Steve said. The raven on Mormont's shoulder made its comment sound again, and Mormont reached up to it with a gesture that had long since stopped being conscious. There's another consideration, the Lord Commander said. Stannis is already coming here. He received my ravens, the ones I sent 6 months ago about the ranging reports. He's bringing his army to the wall. A pause. He arrives in 4 days. Steve absorbed this. And his Red Priestess. Mormont looked at him sharply. You know about Melisandre. I've heard enough, Steve said. He had been assembling the picture of Stannis's advisor from fragments. Varys's careful characterization in King's Landing. References in conversations with the Brotherhood. The specific way people's voices changed when they spoke about her. The combination of fear and compulsion that suggested someone who dealt in genuine power rather than its performance. What does she want? What she always wants, Mormont said. What her God wants, as she describes it. He was quiet for a moment. The Lord of Light. Lawler. Fire against the dark. He looked at Steve with the eyes of a man who had spent his life as a pragmatist and was currently in the process of revising his pragmatism's scope. After what you've described about the whites and the fire, I find I'm less comfortable dismissing her theology than I was 3 months ago. Steve found Beric Dondarrion in the castle Blackyard at dusk, standing at the wall's base with his hand against the stone, in the same position Steve had stood in 3 nights ago. The Brotherhood's Lord looked at Steve when he approached, and his expression carried the specific quality of a man who had received information through a channel that wasn't entirely explicable and was deciding how to present it. Thuras saw something else, Beric said. Last night, while you were ranging. Tell me, Steve said. He saw you, Beric said. Not here, somewhere north. Beyond the wall. Standing in front of something that he describes as. He paused. As a king, but not a living king. Something that wore the shape of authority the way a corpse wears clothes. Something old. He looked at Steve carefully. He says your shield was the only color in the vision. Everything else was white and blue. The shield was the color it is. Steve looked at the vibranium disc on his arm. Its surface caught the last of the evening light with its characteristic impossible cleanliness. He had stopped trying to fully explain the shield, what it was made of, what it could do, why it had survived intact through everything that had been thrown at it in 2 worlds. He accepted it the way he accepted the serum's gifts, as tools, not miracles, to be used rather than contemplated. Did Thuras see what happened? Steve asked. He saw you standing, Barrick said. That's all. He paused. He said that in itself was significant. That in the vision, the fact that you were standing was the remarkable part. The wall above them was catching the last light on its southern face. The ice turning briefly gold before. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the color left it. In the darkening sky above the wall's top edge, the first stars appeared, the same hard, clear northern stars that Steve had been watching since he arrived at Castle Black. But tonight they seemed to carry a different quality, as if the sky itself was paying the same kind of attention to the next few days that the wall had been paying to the last several thousand years. John found him there as the dark fully settled. The young man had cleaned up since the ranging, fresh clothes. The cut on his jaw from the White's assault treated and bandaged, but he carried the specific altered quality of someone who has seen something that has permanently updated their understanding of the world's actual scale. He stood beside Steve at the wall's base and looked up at its height against the night sky and was quiet for a moment. In the way he was quiet, not absence but the presence of very active thought. I keep thinking about the pattern, John said. At the fist. Good, Steve said. John looked at him. Good. It means you're taking it seriously, Steve said. The people who stop thinking about things like that are the ones who normalize them. You don't want to normalize that. John was quiet again. Then, the Night's Watch has 300 men. Even with Stannis's army, what is it, 5,000? Against what we saw? Against what made those patterns and arranged those bodies and deployed those whites with tactical intelligence, he stopped. The numbers don't work. Numbers rarely work against existential threats, Steve said. You don't win those with numbers. Then how? Steve looked up at the wall. You find the thing that matters. The specific weakness, the specific point, the specific action that changes the equation entirely. Every threat has one. Finding it is usually the hard part. The fighting is almost secondary. Dragonglass, John said. Valyrian steel. Weapons, Steve said. Weapons matter. But weapons solve the soldiers. They don't solve the commander. John went very still beside him. The Night King, he said quietly, as if the name had been in him for a while and he'd been waiting for the right moment to say it aloud. If there's a commander, if the walkers serve something or someone, there's always a commander, Steve said. Above them the stars continued their hard, clear vigil over the wall, and the cold pressed down with the patient weight of something that had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. The following morning Stannis Baratheon's fleet was visible from the wall's top, his ships rounding the eastern headland, under gray skies with the systematic precision of an armada under the command of someone who had spent his life in naval operations, and for whom disorder was a moral failing, rather than a tactical one. Steve watched from the wall's top with John beside him and Mormont slightly behind. The Lord Commander's expression carrying the complicated mixture of relief and wariness. That was the appropriate response to being rescued by someone whose methods and motivations you only partially trusted. He's early, Mormont said. He's precise, Steve said. There's a difference. Mormont looked at him. You know him? I know his type, Steve said. I've served with commanders like him. The ones who believe that doing the right thing and doing it correctly are the same thing. He paused. They're usually right about the first part and more complicated about the second. And the woman? Mormont said. On the lead ship's deck, visible even at this distance, through the quality of her stillness and the specific way the people around her maintained a careful radius as if proximity required deliberate management. Melisandre stood at the prow looking north. Even at distance there was something about the quality of her attention that registered, not threatening exactly, but absolute. The attention of someone for whom the wall and what lay beyond. It was not a crisis to be managed but a confirmation of something she had been waiting to confirm. Steve watched her for a moment. She was looking at the wall. Then, slowly, without apparent reason, she looked at him. He held her gaze across the distance, which was too great for normal vision to make possible, and felt in the stark token warm against his palm, and in the current that ran through this world's version of whatever. The force was the specific sensation of two forces recognizing each other as significant variables in the same equation. The woman, Steve said, is going to be the most interesting conversation I have today. Below them, Stannis Baratheon's fleet continued its precise, inevitable approach toward Castle Black's harbor. 5,000 soldiers and one red priestess and enough dragonglass to arm every man at the wall 3 times over, arriving exactly on schedule because Stannis Baratheon did not believe in arriving any other way. The wall caught the morning light on its southern face and held it briefly golden before the clouds moved and the light went gray again. Winter, Steve thought, looking north. Coming. Stannis Baratheon was the kind of man who made Steve think of certain generals he'd known in the 40s. Not the celebrated ones whose names ended up on buildings, but the ones who had actually won the difficult campaigns. The ones whose competence was so total and so unadorned by charisma that history tended to assign the credit elsewhere. He received Steve in the Castle Black Great Hall 2 hours after landing, having spent those 2 hours conducting a systematic inspection of the wall's defenses that Mormont described afterward with the expression of a man who had been professionally evaluated and found the experience both humbling and oddly reassuring. Stannis sat across the table from Steve with the specific posture of a man for whom comfort was a concept he acknowledged intellectually, but hadn't personally invested in. His jaw set in the permanent configuration of someone who had been grinding his teeth against injustice for so long that his face had organized itself around the habit. He was not what people who used the word kingly to mean impressive would have called kingly. He was what people who used the word to mean governing would have recognized. Immediately, he looked at Steve's shield for exactly 3 seconds, then looked at Steve. "You're not from here," Stannis said. "No," Steve said. "Where?" "A long way away. Further than I can explain in terms that would be useful to either of us." Stannis accepted this with the expression of a man filing an unexplained variable for later rather than allowing it to disrupt his current operational focus. "You've been beyond the wall 2 days ago," Steve said, "with the ranging party. Tell me what you saw." Steve told him. He gave Stannis the same operational briefing he'd given Mormont, with the additions from the ranging, the pattern at the fist, the White's tactical deployment, the fire and Valyrian steel findings, his assessment of the intelligence operating behind the White Walker threat. He spoke without embellishment and without hedging, because Stannis was the kind of man who treated hedging as a form of disrespect, and because the information was serious enough that embellishment would have been a moral failure. Stannis listened with absolute stillness. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them identifying the exactly correct variables: the Whites' response time to fire, whether the Valyrian steel's effect had been confirmed by more than one observation, the pattern at the fist's specific arrangement, and whether Steve had recorded it. Steve answered each question with equal precision, and when he was done, Stannis was quiet for 40 seconds. Steve counted before speaking. "The Iron Throne is mine by right," Stannis said. "I have not abandoned that claim, and I will not. But," he paused on the word with the specific weight of a man for whom conjunctions carried moral significance, "the kingdom I intend to rule requires living subjects. The threat beyond the wall supersedes the succession question in immediate priority." He looked at Steve directly. "You need dragonglass." "In quantity," Steve said. "Weapons for every man at the wall. More if we can manage it." "Dragonstone's supply is substantial," Stannis said. "We brought what we could carry. It will arm your Night's Watch and my soldiers with remainder. I will send ships for more within the fortnight." He paused. "What else do you need?" "Your army positioned at the wall," Steve said. "Not just Castle Black. The full length. The wall is 700 miles, and the Night's Watch is spread so thin across it that any coordinated assault on multiple points simultaneously would be catastrophic." Stannis looked at him with the expression of a man recognizing a military assessment that had already reached the same conclusion independently. "Agreed. My commanders will coordinate with Mormont on positioning." He paused. "And the Night King?" Steve looked at him. "Melisandre has spoken of it," Stannis said, with the specific tone of a man who engaged with his advisor's theology, pragmatically without fully committing to it himself. "A commander. An original. She says your shield is relevant to this." He said it the way he said everything, flatly, as information rather than drama. Your Red Priestess said that before she'd spoken to me, Steve said. She speaks to her god before she speaks to people, Stannis said. She finds it more reliable, the faintest possible. Dryness in his voice suggested that Stannis Baratheon had opinions about this ordering of consultations that he had. Learn not to express directly. She will want to speak with you today. I'd recommend allowing it. I'd already decided to, Steve said. Stannis looked at him with something that was not quite approval. Stannis did not appear to traffic in approval, but was in the category of professional respect, the specific acknowledgement of one serious person for another. One more thing, he said. You were in King's Landing. You stood beside Eddard Stark on the September of Baelor. Yes, Steve said. Ned Stark was the most honorable man I've ever known, Stannis said, with the flat directness of someone delivering a statement of fact rather than sentiment. He was also, often, strategically impractical. A pause. His daughters are safe? North on a ship, Steve said. As of 6 days ago. Stannis nodded once. Good. He stood, which ended the meeting with the efficiency of a man for whom meetings ended when their informational content was exhausted rather than when social convention suggested. Melisandre is in the East Tower. She's been there since we landed. He paused at the door. She knew you were here before the ships were in harbor. I mention this so you're not unsettled by how she begins the conversation. Steve had been through considerable amounts of unsettling in his life and found that forewarned was genuinely forearmed. He went to the East Tower. Melisandre was standing at the room's single window looking north when he entered, which was where he'd expected her to be. North was the direction that mattered up here, and she was a woman for whom the direction that mattered was the direction she faced. She was taller than he'd expected and younger looking than her reputation implied, with red hair and red robes and eyes that were doing something that his eyes couldn't quite fully process, not glowing, not supernatural in any visible way, but carrying the quality of someone who was simultaneously in this room and also in some other location that happened to be the same space. She turned when he entered and looked at him with the directness of someone who had already had the conversation they were about to have in a context that gave her information he didn't have access to. You are not of this world, she said. That's established, Steve said. You are not touched by Lawler, she said. And yet, she paused, tilting her head slightly. You carry something, a warmth that my god's fire recognizes even if it does not own it. She looked at the shield. And that, what do you see in it? Steve asked, genuinely curious. Not what it is, she said. What it does. It is the only object I have encountered in my long life that seems to have decided what it is. 4. She paused. Most objects are made for purposes. This one has chosen its purpose. The distinction is significant. Steve looked at her carefully. She was performing. She was always performing. He suspected the performance, so deeply integrated into her operation that the line between the performance and the person had dissolved long ago. But underneath the performance, the assessment was real. She was telling him something accurate in the vocabulary she had available. You saw something in your fire, he said. About me. About what's north of the wall. I saw you standing, she said, in the place where the long night begins. Standing between the living and the dead. She moved to the room's center, the red robes moving with her in the cold air from the window. In every vision I have had of the war to come, the great figures of light and fire are present. Azor Ahai reborn, the prince that was promised. She paused. You appear in none of those visions. You appear instead in the margins, the places where the visions don't quite account for everything. Her eyes held his with the absolute attention of someone used to being the most significant presence in any room, finding someone who didn't respond to that the way others did and finding the difference interesting. The Lord of Light did not send you, but whatever did send you chose the same destination. I wasn't sent, Steve said. I ended up here. Nothing ends up anywhere, Melisandre said, with the serene certainty of someone for whom accident was a category that didn't fully exist. Everything arrives. Steve let this sit without arguing it. Not because he agreed, but because arguing theology with someone whose theology was actively producing results in the material world seemed like a low priority use of the current window. The Night King, he said. Tell me what you know. She was quiet for a moment, a different kind of quiet than her usual composure. The quiet of someone accessing something that cost them something to access. He was a man once, she said, before the first long night, made into what he is by the children of the forest, as a weapon against the first men, and then, as weapons do when made with too much power and too little wisdom, became something beyond what his makers intended. She looked at Steve steadily. He commands because everything he touches becomes part of his command. Every death serves him. Every fallen soldier rises in his army. She paused. He has never encountered something that could not be killed and could not be turned. The implication sat between them in the East Tower's cold air. Steve looked at the shield on his arm, at the vibranium that had come from a meteor strike in a country in his world, that had been shaped by human hands into something that had then decided, as Melisandre said, what it was for, that had survived everything thrown at it across 2 worlds without a scratch. You think the shield matters, he said. I think you matter, she said carefully. The shield is part of why, but only part. She looked at him with those eyes that were in multiple places simultaneously. You have faced things that should have destroyed you. You have chosen, each time, not to be destroyed. That choice, she paused, that specific refusal, is rare in any world. Here it may be the rarest thing of all. I just don't know how to quit, Steve said, which was the most honest version of the answer. Melisandre looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he'd entered the room, something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but became briefly, genuinely human. The specific expression of someone who has been carrying an enormous weight for a very long time and has just met something that makes the weight feel briefly more bearable. Neither does the Night King, she said quietly. That is why it must be you. Outside the East Tower's window, the wall caught the afternoon light on its southern face and held it gold for a moment, before the clouds moved and the world went gray again. The dragging glass distribution took 2 days, which was 1 day longer than Steve wanted, and 1 day shorter than Mormont's quartermaster had initially estimated, the difference being Steve's involvement in the logistics. He had learned in the war that supply operations ran on the specific energy of whoever was driving them, leave them to their own momentum, and they expanded to fill available time, apply focus pressure at the right points, and they compressed without losing quality. He worked alongside the Night's Watch stewards and Stannis' soldiers through both days, which produced 2 effects. The operation moved faster, and the men doing it got a close look at what Steve Rogers was like when he was working rather than fighting, which turned out to be as useful for morale as the fighting had been. By the evening of the 2nd day, every man at Castle Black had a dragging glass blade. The distribution to the wall's other garrisons, Shadow Tower, Eastwatch by the Sea, and the 17 manned castles between them was underway via Raven coordination and rider relay. It wasn't enough. Steve knew it wasn't enough, but it was more than nothing, which was what they'd had 3 days ago, and in his experience, the distance between nothing and something was always more significant than the distance between something and enough. Jon had spent the 2 days doing something Steve found instructive to watch. He had been talking to Stannis' soldiers, not formally, not strategically, but with the specific quality of a young man who understood that the men who would stand beside him in a fight were worth knowing as people rather than as resources, and that knowing them produced better outcomes in both the immediate tactical sense and in the longer moral sense. That Jon Snow seemed to navigate by instinct rather than calculation. The soldiers responded to it the way soldiers always responded to that quality in an officer, with the particular loyalty that was different from the loyalty produced by authority and considerably more durable under pressure. Steve watched this and thought of Robb and thought of Ned and thought that whatever the Stark family had done wrong in the political arena, and they had done things wrong, the specific wrongs of people whose virtues were calibrated for a better world than the one they inhabited, they had done something deeply right in raising children who understood that other people were real. On the 3rd day, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, the incremental temperature decline that the northern autumn produced. The kind you adjusted to over days as your body recalibrated its baseline. This was sudden, a drop of 20 degrees in 4 hours, that the Castle Black veterans recognized, with the specific facial expression of people whose bodies remembered something their minds had only heard about. The sky above the wall went from gray to white to the specific hard, opaque white of a sky that had stopped being sky and become something else. A ceiling, a boundary, the underside of a system that was not weather in the conventional sense, but weather's ancient, purposeful cousin. It's starting, Dolores said at the evening meal, with the flat delivery of a man for whom the apocalypse was primarily an opportunity to be correct about something he'd said for years. I said it would start before the new moon. Nobody listened. Nobody argued with him now. Mormont called the full command to his solar that evening, his senior rangers. Stannis's commanders, Steve, John, Beric Dondarrion, who had been included because Steve had insisted on it and Mormont had deferred without much resistance. The Raven sat on its perch in the corner and watched the assembled group, with eyes that Steve had stopped finding merely animal. We have reports from Eastwatch, Mormont said, spreading a map across the desk. A rider came through the gate 2 hours ago. He was the only survivor of a patrol of 8 sent out 48 hours ago to survey the eastern approach. He paused. He is not currently able to give a coherent account of what he encountered. The Maester is with him. Another pause. What he was able to communicate before coherence left him was the number 100,000. The room absorbed this. Steve looked at the map. The walls 700-mile length. The gaps between manned castles. The specific geometric problem of defending a linear fortification against a force that could attack at any point along its length simultaneously. And that did not have supply lines, did not have logistics, did not have the conventional vulnerabilities that made large armies manageable military problems. They'll attack multiple points, Steve said. Not just Castle Black. The entire wall is the target. Agreed, said Stannis's senior commander, a lean man named Roland Storm, whose military instincts Steve had been quietly evaluating for 3 days and found sound. Distributed assault. Force us to choose which sections to reinforce and which to sacrifice. There's no section we can sacrifice, John said. No, Steve agreed. Which is what they're counting on. He looked at the map. The wall isn't their real objective. The room looked at him. They want to get south of it, Steve said. The wall is the obstacle. Breaching it at any point serves the same purpose. Once they're south of it in numbers, the wall becomes irrelevant. They could come through a section we've left with 5 men as easily as through Castle Black if we've stripped it to reinforce the main engagement. He traced the map with one finger, east to west along the wall's length. So they distribute the assault to distribute our response. And they concentrate at the weakest point that our distribution creates. Which means we can't concentrate either, Roland Storm said. Which means we need something else, Steve said. Something that changes the equation rather than matching it. He looked at Melisandre, who had been standing at the room's edge in the specific way she occupied spaces, present but slightly outside the frame of the gathering, as if she was simultaneously in the room and observing the room from elsewhere. The Night King. Where is he in relation to the army? Behind it, Melisandre said. Always behind. He does not lead from the front. She paused. He does not need to. The army moves because he wills it. He wills it from a position of safety, which is, she paused, the behavior of something that has learned to be careful, something that has been hurt before, or something that understands its own strategic value, Steve said. Remove the commander and the army loses its coherence. He knows that, so he stays back. Dragonglass and Valyrian steel kill the soldiers, John said. He was looking at Steve with the expression of someone following a line of reasoning and seeing where it was going. But the Night King is the source, Steve said. Kill the soldiers, and he makes more. Find the Night King, and the equation changes entirely. He looked around the room. Which means the battle at the wall is a holding action. Necessary, essential, but secondary to the real objective. Stannis had been listening with the absolute stillness he brought to everything. His jaw set, his eyes on the map. You're proposing to go through their army, he said. It was not a question, and it was not an objection. It was the tone of a man identifying what was being said with perfect accuracy. I'm proposing that while Stannis' army and the Night's Watch hold the wall, a smaller group goes north, Steve said. Fast, mobile, specifically targeting the Night King's position. Suicide, Roland Storm said. Possibly, Steve agreed. But the alternative is holding the wall indefinitely against a force that replenishes itself from our casualties. Attrition works for them and against us. We can't win a war of attrition against something that turns every man we lose into a soldier for the other side. The room was quiet, with the specific quality of people confronting a logic they couldn't refute and wish they could. I'll go, Jon said. Steve had expected this. I know, he said. I'll go, said Beric Dondarrion from the room's edge, with the specific simplicity of a man for whom death had already done its worst and lost the ability to serve as a deterrent. And Thuras, and whoever else the Lord Commander can spare. 6 people, Steve said. Fast horses, dragging last weapons, and whatever Valyrian steel we have. We go north while the battle holds the walls. Defenders in place, and the Night King's attention is on the assault. He paused. Speed and surprise, not force. We can't match their force. Stannis looked at him across the map. And if you find the Night King, what then? Steve held the map in his gaze. For a moment, the vast, white space above the wall where no one had drawn anything because no one who went there came back with information worth recording. He thought about Melisandre's vision, about standing in the place where the long night began, the shield the only color in a world of white and blue, about what stopped things that couldn't be stopped by conventional means. He thought about every time in his life he had faced something that shouldn't have been survivable, and had survived it anyway, not through power, not through superior force, through the specific, stubborn refusal to accept the terms that the threat was trying to impose, through finding the one thing that the threat hadn't accounted for and making it matter. I'll figure it out when I see him, Steve said. It was the most honest answer he had. In his experience, it was also the most accurate one. The plans you made before seeing the thing were always superseded by the reality of the thing, and the quality that mattered most when the reality arrived was the ability to adapt faster than the threat could respond. Mormont looked at him for a long moment. The raven on its perch made its comment sound. Take what you need, Mormont said. Go tonight. Outside the Solar's window, the wall rose against the white sky, and above the wall's top edge, barely visible in the gathering dark, something that might have been the first lights of the dead armies. Advance was visible in the north, tiny, cold, blue-white, the color that ice was when there was nothing behind it. Moving south, Jon appeared at Steve's shoulder as the meeting broke, and the commanders dispersed to their positions with the focused urgency of people who understood that the next several hours were the kind that histories were written about. When histories survive to be written, are we actually going to win this? Jon asked. Steve looked at the lights moving in the north beyond the wall and felt the Stark token warm in his closed fist and the current of whatever this world's version of the Force was running, faster and stranger than it had since he'd crossed through the wall's gate. Ask me tomorrow, he said. They went through the wall's gate at midnight, 6 of them, as planned. Steve, Jon, Beric Dondarrion, Thuras of Myr, Dolorous Edd, who had invited himself with the specific logic that someone who expected to die anyway was the correct person for a mission with poor survival odds, and a Night's Watch ranger named Qhorin Halfhand, whose reputation among the Castle Black veterans was the particular reputation that accrues to people who are very good at surviving things that kill everyone around them. Ghost went with them because Ghost had decided this independently, and Jon had long since learned that arguing with the dire wolf about decisions the dire wolf had already made was a use of energy with no return. The northern side of the wall at midnight was different from the northern side at dawn, darker in a way that wasn't simply the absence of light, but the presence of something that occupied the space. Light normally filled. The cold was absolute. Not the brutal but comprehensible cold of a northern winter, but a cold that had intention behind it the way the whites' silence had intention behind it. A cold that was the atmospheric expression of a will rather than a weather system. Steve felt it through his suit, with the enhanced sensitivity the serum gave him, and registered it as information rather than discomfort. The cold was thicker to the northwest, which meant that was where the source was, which meant that was the direction. He led them northwest. They rode fast through the haunted forest. Using Ghost as their forward sensor, the direwolf ranged ahead at distances. That kept it visible at the edge of the torchlight and communicated through the specific vocabulary of its body language. What it was finding. The whites were south and east, moving toward the wall in the numbers that the Eastwatch rider had reported. The bulk of the dead army flowing toward Stannis's defensive positions with the patient, inexorable momentum of something that had been waiting thousands of years for this specific direction of travel and found. The waiting over. The northwest was quieter, not the weighted silence of white proximity, but the deeper silence of the Night King's position, the silence of a commander watching his battle from a remove that kept him safe and gave him full visibility of the engagement's development. 2 hours north of the wall, the haunted forest ended, and the landscape changed into something that Steve had no adequate reference for: a vast open plain of snow and ice. The terrain featureless in every direction except northwest, where a rise in the ground created the suggestion of elevated position without being dramatic enough to call a hill. In this world of flat white, in the dark, it was almost invisible. Almost. The blue-white lights were there, stationary, 8 of them, arranged in a loose perimeter around a central point that was darker than the surrounding dark, a darkness that had density, that absorbed rather than simply lacking light. Steve stopped the group at the forest's edge and studied it with his enhanced vision and the tactical assessment that had been running continuously since they'd left the wall's gate. 8 White Walkers, one central figure. There, he said quietly. Beric came up beside him and looked. Even at this distance, in the dark, the flaming swords. Potential was visible in Beric's posture, the specific readiness of a man whose weapon was part of him in a way that went beyond technique. The outer 8, Beric said. Can we get through them? Not quietly, Steve said. Not all 6 of us. He looked at the group, Jon with Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword, at his hip, Beric with his flaming sword, Thuras with his own fire-touched blade, Ed and Corin with dragonglass weapons. We split. Beric, Thuras, Ed, Corin, you take the outer ring. Draw them. Make noise. Give me and Jon a path through the center. That leaves 2 of us against 8 White Walkers, Dolorous Ed said, with the flat effect of a man for whom the objection was primarily informational rather than a refusal. 3 of you, Steve said. Beric's died before. It slows them down even when it doesn't stop them. He paused. You just need to hold them long enough. Long enough for what? Corin asked. For whatever happens when I reach the Night King, Steve said. The honest answer. No one liked it, which was the appropriate response to honest answers in situations like this one. Beric looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who had been to death and back enough times to have developed a working relationship with the concept. Make it count, Beric said. Always, Steve said. They separated at the forest's edge, the 4 moving east to approach the outer ring from an angle that would pull the White Walker perimeter away from the center. Steve and Jon moving directly north through the darkness toward the central point. Ghost silent between them. The direwolf's white coat making it nearly invisible against the snow. The distraction hit with the specific controlled chaos of Beric, Dondarrion's flaming sword, igniting in the dark a burst of orange warmth. In the blue-white world that the White Walkers responded to with the immediate reorientation of sentries who had identified a threat. Steve heard the engagement begin behind him and did not look back, because looking back was the decision he had already made not to make, and he ran. The ground between the forest's edge and the central darkness was 300 yards of open snow, and Steve covered it in a time that would have been impossible for anyone who hadn't been rebuilt in a government laboratory in 1943. Jon kept pace behind him, not matching Steve's speed but close enough, driven by something that was part physical conditioning and part the specific determination of someone who has decided that this moment is the one and that the decision has been made and there is nothing left to do but execute it. The Night King was waiting for them. Steve had expected this. The arrangement at the Fist had told him that what commanded the dead army possessed intelligence. And intelligence at that level meant the Night King had known about the ranging parties approach since they'd left the forest's edge, possibly earlier. The 8 White Walkers were a perimeter designed to be breached, an invitation as much as a defense, drawing the most capable threat into a one-on-one confrontation on ground the Night King had chosen. He was taller than Steve had expected, not monstrously large, but tall with the specific physical authority of something that had existed so long its body had organized itself around the concept of permanence. His armor was ice, but ice that had been shaped rather than formed naturally. The specific, deliberate craft of something that understood aesthetics, in the way the pattern at the fist had understood aesthetics as a language, a communication, a statement about what he was and what he intended. His eyes were the blue-white of the Whites, but with something behind them, the something the Whites lacked, the intelligence, the will, the accumulated weight of thousands of years of singular purpose. He looked at Steve with those eyes, and Steve looked back. Between them, 40 feet of packed snow. John came up to Steve's left, long claw drawn, his breath coming fast from the run but his body already settling into the combat readiness that Steve recognized as genuine rather than performed. The Night King looked at John with what might have been recognition. Then he looked at Steve, at the shield specifically, and what moved across his ancient face was something Steve had not expected and took a half-second to process. Curiosity, not threat assessment, not tactical calculation. Genuine curiosity, the expression of something. Encountering a variable it hadn't previously encountered in thousands of years of conflict and finding the novelty. If an entity this old could find anything novel, genuinely interesting. He raised one hand. From the snow around them, figures began to rise, not Whites, older than Whites. The specific quality of things that had been dead so long they'd passed through death and arrived somewhere else. They rose slowly, with the deliberateness of something that understood it was making a point rather than simply deploying resources. Steve counted 8, rising from the snow in a circle, surrounding them. John took a step forward with long claw raised, and Steve caught his arm. "Wait," Steve said. John looked at him. "There." "Wait," Steve said again, because the Night King had not moved, had not directed the risen figures to advance, was watching Steve with those curious ancient eyes in the specific way of someone who was testing a hypothesis rather than executing an attack. Was waiting, Steve realized, for Steve to do what everyone else had done in thousands of years of this, to react, to panic, to make the first move that gave the Night King the information he needed about what Steve was and how he operated. Steve stood still, the cold pressed down. The risen figures held their positions in the circle. John held his position with the specific trembling control of someone restraining an impulse that every instinct was demanding he follow. Ghost was motionless beside John, yellow eyes fixed on the Night King, the direwolf's enormous body doing the fine trembling it had done at the stream bed, but steadier now, as if proximity to the source of the thing it feared had paradoxically produced a kind of calm. Steve looked at the Night King and felt in the stark token warm in his closed fist, and in the current of whatever this world's force was the specific sensation he had learned to trust across decades of impossible situations. The sensation of finding the still point at the center of a threat, the place where the threat's logic was visible in its entirety, and the single point that changed the equation was identifiable. The Night King's curiosity was the still point. He had never encountered something that looked back, that didn't react, that stood in the center of his demonstration of power and held its ground not from ignorance of the threat or from the specific courage that was really just ignorance dressed up, but from genuine assessment, from having looked at the threat completely and decided that standing was still the right answer. The Night King took a step forward. Steve raised the shield. Not aggressively, not the combat-ready position he'd used at the stream bed. He raised it the way you raised something you wanted someone to look at. Held it up, face forward, the vibranium surface catching the blue-white light of the Night King's eyes and reflecting it back. Clean, unchanged, the shield's surface as perfectly unblemished as it had been the morning he'd woken up face down in Riverland's mud. The Night King stopped. He looked at the shield with those ancient eyes, and something moved across his face that was more complex than curiosity. Something that might have been, in something that had been a man once, recognition. The recognition of something that, like him, had decided what it was for and could not be moved from that decision. He reached out one hand toward the shield. Steve held his ground. Jon moved. It wasn't tactical, it was Jon Snow, which meant it was the movement of someone who had processed the situation completely and determined that the moment the Night King's attention shifted to the shield was the moment. Longclaw had its best angle, and Jon Snow did not waste best angles. Longclaw came in a horizontal arc toward the Night King's turned head with the speed of someone who had been training since childhood and the determination of someone for whom this specific moment was the one everything had been building toward. The Night King caught the blade with his bare hand. The Valyrian steel that had shattered a white at the streambed held in the Night King's grip without penetrating. The cold of his hand meeting the steel's edge and not stopping it exactly, but slowing it. The Night King's strength and cold combining into a resistance that Longclaw's momentum couldn't fully overcome. The blade stopped 6 inches from the Night King's face. He looked at Jon over the caught blade with those ancient eyes, and what was in them was not anger, and not contempt, but something that was almost, in the most disturbing way imaginable, respect. The recognition of something worth stopping rather than simply redirecting. Steve hit him with the shield. Full force, the charge that had been building from the moment he'd decided to hold his ground and wait. The complete kinetic force of a super soldier's body behind a disc of the most impact-resistant material in his world, covering 40 feet in less than 2 seconds and connecting with the Night King's turned body with a sound, like the world's oldest ice cracking for the first time. The Night King went down. The Night King did not stay down. Steve had known he wouldn't, had built the plan around what happened after the first strike rather than assuming the first strike would be sufficient, because nothing in his experience had ever made the mistake of assuming one hit solved a problem of this magnitude. He was already moving as the Night King rose, the shield repositioned, putting himself between the ancient figure and Jon, who was back on his feet with Longclaw raised, and the three of them formed a triangle in the snow, the Night King at its apex, Steve and Jon at its base, with Ghost circling the perimeter, in the specific orbit of an animal that had moved past fear into something that was its own version of the determination Steve recognized in himself. The risen figures in the circle had not advanced. This registered as significant. The Night King had not directed them to engage, which meant either he was confident enough in his own capability to handle this without assistance, or he was still in the assessment phase, still running the hypothesis test that the curiosity in his eyes suggested he'd been running since they'd arrived. Steve filed it and kept moving. The Night King raised both hands. What came from them was not fire. That was the other side's tool, but cold in its active form. Cold as a directed force rather than an ambient condition. A wave of it that hit Steve's shield and spread across its surface in a sheet of instant ice that covered the vibranium in a 1/4 inch of blue-white frost and pushed Steve back 3 feet through the packed snow. He felt it through the shield's grip, not penetrating, not damaging, but the force behind it was extraordinary. The specific force of something that had been building pressure for thousands of years and had finally found a surface it couldn't immediately dissolve. The shield held. Steve planted his feet in the snow and held with it. And the cold wave continued for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer and then stopped. And Steve looked over the shield's iced edge at the Night King with the specific expression he wore when a threat had done its worst, and found him still standing. Jon came in from the right while the Night King's attention was on Steve. Not the telegraphed heroic charge, but the controlled, technically precise movement of a fighter who had learned to read combat geometry and exploit openings with the efficiency that distinguished skilled fighters from brave ones. Longclaw connected with the Night King's side, and where it connected, the ancient armor cracked, not shattered. Not the crystalline fragmentation of a white, but cracked, the Valyrian steel, finding the frequency of the ice armor's structure and beginning the work of disaggregation. The Night King turned toward Jon with the speed of something that had been conserving its velocity and released it selectively, and his hand connected with Jon's chest with enough force to send Jon 8 feet through the air and into the snow with a sound that Steve registered as bad and filed for immediate attention once the situation allowed. It didn't allow yet. Steve was inside the Night King's guard before he could redirect, the shield driving upward in the specific strike that targeted the center of mass rather than the extremities. And the Night King went back a step, one step, which on a surface of packed snow in these conditions represented genuine defensive difficulty. The small resistances adding up. Steve followed it immediately with a second strike, the shield working the cracked section of the ice armor that Jon's blade had found, and heard the crack deepen and spread. The Night King caught Steve's shield arm. The grip was the cold of the wall multiplied by something that had no natural upper limit, and it radiated up Steve's arm through the suit, with the specific quality of a force that was trying to do to Steve's arm what the cold wave had done to the shield's surface: freeze it, immobilize it, make it part of the Night King's domain rather than Steve's. Steve felt it working against the serum's enhanced resilience and felt the serum working against it in the specific way of two fundamental forces meeting at a boundary and contesting the boundary with every available resource. He did not let go of the shield. He had held the shield through things that should have taken it from him across two worlds and several decades, and the thing that had kept it in his grip through all of those things was not strength, which could be exceeded, but decision, the specific, total decision that the shield was not leaving his hand, which was a different category of force than muscular resistance, and which the Night King's cold, for all its ancient power, was encountering for the first time. The stark token in his other fist was so warm it should have been burning his palm. Steve twisted inside the Night King's grip, using the locked arm as a pivot, and drove the shield's edge into the cracked section of ice armor. With every pound of force his enhanced body could produce in the compressed geometry of a close-quarters strike, the crack that resulted was not the surface disaggregation of the previous impacts. It was structural, the sound of something fundamental giving way, the sound of ice that had been cold for thousands of years, encountering a force that had decided it was going to be colder. The Night King released his grip. He stepped back, not in retreat, in the recalibration of something that had updated its assessment of the threat and was adjusting its approach. His ancient eyes moved between Steve and the shield, and for a moment the curiosity was entirely gone, and what replaced it was something that Steve recognized from the faces of every significant opponent he'd ever faced. The expression of someone who had been certain of the outcome and has just become less certain. Jon was back on his feet. Steve didn't know how. The impact had been serious, and Jon Snow had the specific resilience of someone who had been fighting since before he was technically old enough to, and whose body had consequently developed a relationship with damage that prioritized function over pain. But he was upright, long claw in hand, moving to the Night King's left flank with blood on his face from the fall, and his expression carrying the absolute determination of someone who has decided this is the hill, and this is the moment. Ghost hit the Night King from behind, not a white. The direwolf had made this distinction with an accuracy that suggested Ghost's understanding of the difference between the animated dead and their source was considerably more sophisticated than anything Steve could fully account for. The enormous white animal connected with the Night King's back with the full weight of a direwolf at full sprint and drove him forward into the space between Steve's shield and Jon's blade simultaneously. Longclaw went into the cracked section, through the ice armor's compromised structure, into whatever existed beneath it. Not flesh in any normal sense, not blood, but something that was the Night King's equivalent of those things. The specific internal organization of a being that had been made rather than born, and maintained by a will rather than by biology. The Valyrian steel found it, and did to it what Valyrian steel did. The Night King looked at Jon. Jon looked at the Night King. Between them, in the 3 seconds before what happened next, something passed that Steve witnessed, without fully comprehending the specific quality of a recognition between two things that were connected in a way that preceded the current moment and would outlast it. The Night King seeing in Jon Snow something that he knew, and Jon Snow seeing in the Night King something that he didn't understand, yet but would, eventually, in the longer story that this moment was part of. Then the Night King shattered. Not gradually. Not the progressive fragmentation of a white subjected to fire or sustained Valyrian steel impact. All at once, the complete, simultaneous crystalline dissolution of something whose coherence had been maintained by a will that the Valyrian steel had just ended. Every part of him disaggregating at the same moment the will stopped. The ice armor and the ancient body and the accumulated cold of thousands of years of purpose all releasing simultaneously into a cloud of frozen particles that the night wind took and dispersed in 3 seconds until nothing remained. Where the Night King had stood except a depression in the snow and the specific quality of a silence that was, for the first time beyond the wall, genuinely empty rather than weighted. The risen figures dropped. All of them. Not just the 8 in the circle, but everywhere. Steve understood with a certainty he couldn't fully explain. The sense of something that had been humming at the edge of perception suddenly stopping. Across the wall. Across the vast army that had been flowing south towards Stannis' positions. Every white and every raised thing simply ceased. Dropped to the snow like puppets whose strings had been cut simultaneously. The coherence that the Night King's will had provided ending the instant the will ended. The silence that followed was the silence of the haunted forest before the long night began, living silence, textured. The specific absence of threat rather than the presence of it. Jon was on his knees in the snow, Longclaw buried in the place where the Night King had stood, his breath coming in visible clouds in the suddenly less hostile air. Ghost pressed against him, the direwolf's enormous head against Jon's shoulder. And Jon's hand came up to the white fur with the unconscious certainty of that gesture that Steve had been watching since Castle Black. Steve stood at the depression in the snow and felt in the stark token, cooler now, for the first time since he'd crossed the wall, the specific quality of something resolved. The current of this world's force had been running fast and strange since the neck, accelerating through Castle Black and through the ranging and through the East Tower conversation with Melisandre and through the 6-person ride north in the dark. Now it ran slow and clear and quiet. The specific quality of water after the rapids. Beric Dondarrion appeared from the east with the others, Thuras, Ed, Corran, all of them marked by the engagement with the White Walker perimeter, but all of them standing, which Steve had not been certain of and received as the specific relief of someone who had sent people into danger and was accounting for them on the other side. Beric's flaming sword was extinguished, but the scar-faced Lord's expression carried the specific quality of a man who has been waiting to stop dying and has just been given permission. Done? Beric asked. Done, Steve said. Thuras was looking at the depression in the snow, where the Night King had been with the expression of a man whose theology has just received the largest possible empirical confirmation. His lips were moving, prayer, Steve assumed, or something that operated in the same register. Jon got to his feet, pulled Longclaw from the snow, looked north, where the white sky was, slowly by degrees, over the course of the next hour, beginning to lighten. Not dawn, something the white sky was, releasing as the will that had driven it southward and downward for years, withdrew the pressure that had been sustaining it. It's stopping, Jon said. Yes, Steve said. They stood in the lightning dark north of the wall and watched the sky change. 6 people and 1 direwolf. And Steve held the Stark token in his closed fist and felt its warmth normalize, becoming the warmth of a piece of steel that had been held in a human hand, rather than the warmth of something responding to a world paying attention. He thought of Ned on the harbor dock, of the handshake, of the gray eyes saying, "Take care of my city," and the answer he'd given. He thought of Meera at the graveside in Sherrick's Mill, the dry-eyed steadiness of a child who had decided to survive. He thought of the King's Road going south, and King's Landing waiting on its hill, and the work that remained. Because the long night ending didn't end the war for the Iron Throne, didn't resolve the succession, didn't heal the Riverlands or protect the small folk from the machinery of great houses, pursuing their ambitions over ordinary lives. The work that remained was enormous. He looked at Jon Snow standing in the lightning, dark with Ghost pressed against his side and Longclaw in his hand and the blood drying on his face, and understood that he was looking at someone who was going to be at the center of everything that came. Next, the politics, the succession, the painful, grinding work of rebuilding a kingdom that had been fracturing for years. Before the long night made the fractures irrelevant, John would need help with that. Different help than Steve could provide. Mostly, the political help, the institutional help, the help that came from understanding how power worked and how to make it work toward something worth having. But some of the help Steve could provide, the kind that involved someone who had no house and no banner and no inheritance to protect, who told the truth because it was the only currency he trusted, who walked toward the fire because walking away had never been something he knew how to do. He looked south, toward the wall's distant line against the changing sky. A lot of work left to do. He started walking.